Good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Mike Tassi, and we're here to talk about a very important subject on everyone's minds, at least it should be, and that is what do we do with this data that we no longer need? So today we're going to be talking about the subject of data destruction and data retention, two very important topics. So again, my name is Mike Tassi with the Privacy Technical Assistance Center.
Good morning. I'm Andrea Williams. I'm also with the Privacy Technical Assistance Center. So we are going to get started. Before we begin, though, a disclaimer. This content was produced by the U.S. Department of Education Student Privacy Policy Office through the Privacy Technical Assistance Center for the purposes of this presentation. The presentation is intended for informational purposes only and does not constitute official policy or guidance from the U.S. Department of Education. If you're looking for something official, please go to our website, studentprivacy.ed.gov. We got all sorts of good stuff there for you. Here's the agenda for today. Remember, our topic is data retention and data destruction under FERPA. We'll be here for about an hour. All right, so we are going to zoom in on data governance. And in case you're not familiar with this term, this is data governance. It really covers everything you do with your data, from bringing it into the system to storing it, using it, sharing it, ensuring your data is secure, private, accurate, available, usable. It covers the data itself and any technology that you use to hold or move or access the data through the life cycle. So all of this stuff is managed or overseen by your data governance board. This is a group of people from your organization that should represent everyone that touches or produces or looks at or smells the data in your organization. So this board is going to develop policies and procedures around the data. They're going to determine the technology to store, to access, to share the data. They are going to set the policies and processes that have to be involved around the data. And this does include when and why data should be retained, when and why data should be destroyed. And of course, data retention and destruction is why we're here today. So we're going to start with record retention requirements under FERPA. And first, we're going to just do a quick review about FERPA itself. So FERPA is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. This is a federal law that affords parents and eligible students certain rights. These include the rights to have access to their education records, the right to seek to have the records amended, the right to consent to the disclosure of personally identifiable information, or PII, from education records, with exceptions, and the right to file a complaint if they feel their FERPA rights have been violated. FERPA applies to schools that receives funds from any program administered by the Department of Education. Most private and faith-based schools at the elementary and secondary levels do not receive these funds and are therefore not subject to FERPA. However, private schools at the post-secondary level generally do receive these funds, in most cases in the form of federal student aid, and therefore are subject to FERPA. FERPA rights belong to the parents if the student is under 18 and not enrolled in post-secondary, and when the student turns 18 or enrolls in post-secondary at any age, the FERPA rights then belong to the student. As with any privacy law, understanding the definitions in FERPA are going to help you understand how and when FERPA may apply. So let's start with this term, education records. Education records are broadly defined to mean those records that are directly related to a student and maintained by an educational agency or institution or by a party acting on their behalf. There are some exceptions to the definition of education records. Those include sole possession records that are used as personal memory aids, law enforcement unit records, peer-graded work prior to being collected and recorded by the teacher, student employment records, and treatment records. So these last two, the student employment records and treatment records, are typically found at the post-secondary level, not at K-12. And remember, one of those basic rights under FERPA is for the parent or eligible student to inspect and review the education record. So there are some requirements around that. School must comply with the request to inspect and review the education record within 45 days under FERPA, although it's important to be aware of state or local laws that may have a shorter time frame. Schools are required to provide access, not provide copies of the record, unless the failure to do so would effectively deny access to the parent or student. For example, if they don't live within commuting distance and can't come to the office and physically see the record. But keep in mind that a technology solution like a screen share would meet that requirement to provide access. Again, other statutes may require copies of the record, but FERPA only requires access. And then finally, important to us today, the school may not destroy a record if a request for access is pending. So we often get asked if the school can charge a fee for copies. And the answer is yes, but let me beat that horse again. FERPA requires access, not copies. So yes, you may charge a fee for copies unless imposing the fee would effectively prevent the parent or eligible student from exercising the right to inspect and review education records. And another important thing to remember is that the access is to the record of the student. So if the record includes information on other students, like it's a video of a fight that's been used for disciplinary purposes, the parent or eligible student are only permitted to inspect and review the specific information related to their child. If you have questions about photos or videos, we do have a resource available on our website. So I encourage you to take a look at that. Okay, so that's access under FERPA. Another of those big rights under FERPA is the right to amend the education record. And the law outlines several steps. The parent or eligible student should identify the portion of the record they believe to contain information that is inaccurate, misleading, or a violation of their privacy rights, and inform the school of the wish to amend the record. The school then must decide within a reasonable period of time whether or not to make that amendment. If the school decides not to amend the record, it must inform the parent or eligible student of their right to a hearing. After the hearing, if the decision is still not to amend the record, the parent or eligible student has a right to insert a statement into the record, and that must be disclosed anytime that portion of the record is disclosed. We do have the resources on our website about this, so I encourage you to take a look if you have questions.
Thank you so much, Andra, and let's move along and talk about some of these FERPA provisions we just talked about when it as it applies to this concept of data retention and data destruction. Now, there are some exceptions, as Andrew mentioned, to the FERPA general consent requirement. And some of these exceptions, it is important to notice what may not require consent, but do have other requirements, such as recordation that may happen or may have to happen as a condition of releasing that information under those exceptions to FERPA. We're going to start with one that's very sort of ubiquitous, and that is the directory information exception. That is, to allow schools to put out certain information about students that is generally not considered to be a privacy risk for purposes like school playbills and that sort of thing. And of course, these are subject to certain considerations around directory information. Of course, there is no recordation requirements associated with some of these. With others that we're going to talk about in just a second, there is a recordation requirement. So if you do happen to have to release information using these exceptions, there is a requirement to annotate that in the record. Some of the other exceptions that apply here to school officials with legitimate educational interest, as defined in your annual notification. If you have an annual notification, and you should, it should identify who you consider to be school officials. Some schools choose to get very finite about that. Other schools are a little more broad in that they may lump school officials into specific categories. But needless to say, you should have a notification to parents so that they know who school officials are and what you consider a school official to be. To schools in which a student seeks or intends to enroll, that is for the release of information if you are matriculating to another sort of higher education or moving from school to school, if the family is moving or whatever the case may be. This exception allows the schools to exchange information, doesn't require the students' consent in order to do that. To authorize representatives of specific federal agencies and state and local education authorities conducting an audit, evaluation, or enforcement of a federally or state-supported education program. So this is the audit and evaluation exception. This is for, as the text mentions there, auditing the effectiveness of federal or state-funded education programs. And of course, to do that, they require access to certain information. Now, there are other exceptions, such as the studies exception. Now, notice I said studies and not research exception, and then that's for a very specific reason that we're going to talk about here in just a minute, in that it is because there are studies conducted for on behalf of the school. And there are certain restrictions associated with those. There are also some exceptions around contingency situations, such as health or safety emergencies. Now, just broadly, FERPA is not going to prevent you from exchanging information with first responders or other parties that are necessary to protect the health or safety of students or others that are involved in an imminent or ongoing emergency. Right. So of course, that is not going to stand in your way. There is no consent required for that. However, we mentioned about those situations in which there is some recordation required. This is one of those situations. If you do happen to have a health or safety emergency, you have to release information. This is one of those things where recordation is required to be maintained along with those records. To accrediting organizations to carry out their accrediting functions. To parents of a dependent student, if we're talking about a post-secondary situation or a situation where students may have turned 18 and the FERPA rights are now belonging to the student. In a post-secondary situation where the FERPA rights have similarly transferred to the student, the parents may be authorized to receive that information. Authorized and permitted, not required, if they are a dependent on those parents' federal income tax forms, or to comply with a judicial order or a subpoena. So that generally requires a reasonable effort to notify the parent or eligible student at their last known address if they receive such an order. But obviously, if you do receive a judicial order or a subpoena, that is the compelling factor there. So we've talked a little bit about the various exceptions. There's two more that we want to kind of just briefly touch on. That is in situations where the child may be in the custody of a child welfare agency or tribal organization for those who are in foster care, in order to address the student's education needs, or to state and local officials pursuant to a state statute in connection with serving the student under the juvenile justice system. And those are two of sort of the outlier exceptions there as well, where there may be the ability to provide that information without consent under certain conditions. Let's dig into two of the big ones. The audit or evaluation exception allows authorized representatives, again, of federal, state, and local officials listed under 9931 of the statute. They may have access to education records in connection with an audit or evaluation of a federal or state-supported education program. So again, it's follow the money, as Andrew mentioned, for the enforcement or compliance with federal legal requirements relating to those programs. So now a couple of important things to remember when we're talking about audit or evaluation. The information released under the audit and evaluation must be protected in a manner that does not permit disclosure of PII to anyone. And pertinent to this discussion here today, when the audit or evaluation is completed, that data must be destroyed or returned. Right? It can't remain in the hands of the auditors in perpetuity. It's not recorded then passed on. All of that information is prohibited from being redisclosed. And so when you reach the end of that audit or evaluation, the data needs to be destroyed. And that brings, obviously an important focus for today's talk. And we're going to talk about how that data can be properly destroyed here in a few minutes. Let's talk about the studies exception. And again, this is a studies exception, not a research exception. So a lot of folks have some confusion about that. Whether, if a researcher comes to you and says, hey, I'd like to get access to your institution's, data because I'm doing a research project on so-and-so, they're not entitled to receive that data. When we talk about studies, we're talking about studies that are conducted for or on behalf of your institution, not simply because some researcher wants access to the data. They must be conducted for or on behalf of the school district, or post-secondary institution. Studies must be for the purposes of developing, validating, or administrating predictive tests, administering student aid programs, or improving instruction. So it's kind of a narrow window. They can't be on any subject. It has to be focused in these areas. And similar to the audit and evaluation exception, these data do not get provided to the researchers or the folks conducting the study in perpetuity. They don't own that data. They don't get to keep that data. They must protect that data so that it permits disclosure to anyone else, and they're not allowed to redisclose that data for any other purposes. And again, when the study has concluded, that data has to be destroyed, and destroyed properly so that it cannot be retrieved. So that leaves us to a question, right? We talked about a lot of the ways in which data can be distributed or disclosed under FERPA without consent. A lot of folks will then ask, well, we talk about this data that we're collecting as organizations. How long do we have to keep this data for? And FERPA is really kind of silent on this. This is not something that FERPA talks at length about. But FERPA is very particular about one particular area of the data lifecycle. So FERPA doesn't care how long you keep the data or if you keep the data, but if there is, because FERPA provides that right to inspect and review, if there is an outstanding request to inspect and review the information, FERPA prohibits the destruction of that data. So you can't pull the Enron on it at the last minute in the middle of the night and start shredding documents. If there is a request from a parent or a student or a guardian of any type to inspect and review under FERPA statute, you are not allowed to destroy that data until that request has been fulfilled. Once it has been, feel free to, FERPA is not going to be the long pole in the tent there. You can get rid of the data under FERPA. It is important to remember, however, that FERPA is not the only law that likely applies to much of this data. There may be other laws at the state or local level which require the retention of certain types of these data. So it's important to know at your state and at your local level what those requirements are.
All right, so let's talk about state requirements. State record retention schedules are probably going to be the thing you look to figure out how long you can keep your data, how long you have to, how long you are, as soon as you can get rid of it, all that sort of thing. So if you've ever been to a PTAC presentation, you should know the answer to every question is it depends, right? So record retention varies across states, across types of record even. So in many cases, things like transcripts and graduation records have to be held indefinitely. But on the other hand, school disciplinary records or health records may only need to be held for a certain period of time, maybe 5 to 7 years after the student leaves the school. Other types of records, like arrest records in the criminal justice system, are going to be held for 7 to 10 years. Tax records are more like 3 to 7. So you need to look at your state-specific requirements, and you're usually going to find those in state statute to talk about what sort of records are covered under these requirements. Some states specify emails, for example, as a record subject to an open records law. So there's that sort of thing to consider too when you're considering figuring out how long you're keeping and which records. Record retention schedules are also governed by local law and organizational policies. And that type of policy is one of those things that's developed by your data governance board. Remember, we talked about that a few minutes ago. So that's something that needs to be included under the list of things that they are developing.
Thanks, Sandra. So as we're talking about data destruction, let's kind of get into the nitty-gritty of this. Data destruction best practices. How do we do this? How do we do it properly? How do we make sure that we're in compliance with these laws? How do we make sure that we retain the stuff that we need to retain? And when we're done with that information, and there's no more operational need for it, how do we get rid of that data in a way that is compliant with the law and with our moral and ethical requirements to kind of protect the people whose information that we have, be good stewards of that data. So the first step is to make sure that you understand what data you have. When we're talking about managing data, the first step is to conduct a data inventory, to go out and understand, what data do we collect? What data do we have in our organization? Where do we store that data? Where does it live in our environment? Right? Sort of a crown jewels assessment, understanding where all the data lives, what it consists of, and then sort of co-locating that to the degree that you can, whatever's practicable for you. The more you can sort of segregate and isolate these islands of data at different categories, the easier it will be for you to protect that data, to understand what you have, and to perform, to retain and destroy that data in compliance with the law. So organizations should absolutely be first conducting those reviews and then racking and stacking data based on things like those retention requirements and the sensitivity level of that data. If you're an organization that doesn't collect any personally identifiable information, hint, that's probably no school on the planet, right? Because we all need to know the name of our students and their grades and assessments and all of these other things. All of that is personally identifiable. But if you're one of those organizations that doesn't have anything, so that rack and stack may be very easy. None of that is very identifiable. It's not very sensitive, so it's an easy task. Unfortunately, if you're in the education business, it's probably not going to be that easy, right? It's going to require a little bit of effort, something that the school should take very seriously. Break it down and do that real hard self-assessment, data inventory, dig out where all that data lives, racking and stacking it by, this data is personally identifiable, but it's not terribly sensitive. Here's really sensitive data, and we definitely need to protect this to the highest degree. That allows you to spend your resources wisely, be good stewards of the data, protect it appropriately, and on a side note, also allows you to manage it a lot better. So why is data destruction important? Well, it can be important for several reasons. First, there may be a legal requirement to get rid of it, right? Either through state or local regulations, and there may be requirements to hold on to that data. But there are other considerations as well, right? The first of that being if you collect and store everything forever, your storage fees might start to pile up. There may be a financial reason or an operational reason that is equally as important, right? If you store all this stuff in the cloud, you're paying some third-party provider to store that data. Those storage costs tend to pile up over time. So getting rid of some of that data may be a fiscally responsible thing to do for you to make your budgets go farther and allow you to spend those resources on other things that are better for your operations. You may be, on the other hand, it may be the right thing to do, right? If we think about sort of the moral and ethical implications of collecting data that is personally identifiable for our students and parents and employees, et cetera, we should always ask ourselves, well, why do we need this data? Is there an operational need to have this data? Or are we just collecting it because we want to have the data? Right? Is there a liability to us as an organization if we collect all this sensitive data and we keep it forever? Does that make us more of a target for a data breach? Or if there is a data breach or a cyber incident, do we put ourselves at greater liability by doing so? So there may be a risk decision here on, when do we get rid of some of this data? Is there going to be harm to individuals, right? If the harm to an individual is going to be greater than the operational benefit that you get for storing this data, and it's at risk of being disclosed in some sort of an incident, there might be some discussions around, hey, do we really need this data? Or is there some way we can mask this data or transform this data so that doesn't present a harm to individuals, right? And if there is, certainly if there is no legal or operational requirement to maintain the data, then organizations should have that discussion in their processes about what do we do to offboard this data to get it out of our hair, right? Keeping in mind that you do probably have a state retention schedule, and some of these data may be required to be kept, even if there's no maybe operational need for your school. State data retention laws may require you to hold on to it for a certain period of time. Outside of that, if again, FERPA has that prohibition on the deletion of records that for which there is a pending request for access. So that's also bearing consideration. So as long as you have a good bead on what state regulations apply, what the retention schedules are, and you know that there's no data, pending data requests for that data, hey, do we need it? No, let's get rid of it. And that should be built into that process, right? As Andrew was talking about data governance, right? The destruction of data at the end of its life cycle is an important part of that data governance process. Important to remember in an era of data breaches where schools are being victimized by sophisticated cyber gangs, their data is being stolen and used for extortion or encrypted so that they get crippling the organization. Remember that you can't have a data breach if you don't have the data, right? So to the degree that you can minimize the amount of data that you hold that has no value to your organization operationally, the better. So let's talk a little bit about the technical aspects of data destruction. There are a couple of resources I want to touch on first, and these are great resources that I would encourage you to check out and reference as you're thinking about, hey, what do we do with our data at the end of its life cycle? PTAC, we've written a sort of a resource called Best Practices for Data Destruction that is out there. That kind of puts it in an educational light, talks about sort of the educational considerations around data destruction, and it draws heavily from the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, special publication 800-88. I know that's a mouthful, but the numbers are important there, which is their guide for media sanitation. And that's a big, thick document that talks about the specifics of how data destruction works and how you should choose a method for data destruction that best fits your needs. And it covers things like shredding or incinerating physical records and how to securely wipe digital data, right? Making sure that the data is really gone. And some of the special considerations around some of your maybe outsourced or cloud provider systems where your data may exist in maybe a third party. So what are we talking about here? Generally speaking, we're not talking about the delete button. Now, for some data, non-sensitive data that doesn't contain, PII, your delete button may be a very effective tool for getting rid of these things. But that's not what we're talking about in most cases when we're talking about data destruction. We're talking about a way to remove that data in a way that it cannot be retrieved. So secure destruction is destruction where even if you're a hacker, even if you're a technologically sophisticated adversary, you're not going to be able to get access to that data. This is especially applicable when we're talking about cloud providers or software platforms as a service where your data may live in someone else's systems. And importantly, it's not just federal, but also state law. So there are a lot of data destruction requirements that are sort of enshrined in state law as well, especially when we start talking about personally identifiable information or sensitive data. check your state regulations as well, because there is likely some sort of weigh-in on the data destruction front. Now, I know, some of you probably question, well, why isn't the delete key deletion? Why isn't that not data destruction? Well, and I think this is an important thing to illustrate the point. I want you to think about your hard drive on your computer, your laptop, or any storage media. Think of it as a library, right? Where you have a whole racks and racks of memory that is filled with books. And on those, each of those books sits in its own location in the library. But libraries, in order to find those books, you've got this card catalog sitting in the middle of your library, has the drawers with the little cards in it in alphabetical order, and you go to that card catalog and you find the card for that particular author or book that you're looking for, and it tells you what shelf and what location on that shelf to find the book that you're looking for. And if we sort of think about that in terms of your computer, those files are stored in a very similar way, in a structured storage medium, either your hard disk or in a solid state drive or a thumb drive or whatever your storage medium might be, on a DVD-ROM or some other sort of media. Those files are stored on the digital shelves, and your computer stores a master sort of card catalog of where to find that. So if we follow this along to its logical conclusion here, what would happen if your library got rid of books the same way your hard drive, your delete button works on your computer? Well, if you were to go to the library and hit the delete button the way you do it on your laptop, the librarian would just go to the card catalog, pull out the card for that book, and tear up the card and throw it away. But they wouldn't bother removing the book from the shelf. The book, with all the data, is still there on that shelf in that location. They just tore up the card in the card catalog. You wouldn't think, if we're getting rid of a book in the library, you wouldn't think that would be sufficient, right? And it's not sufficient to do that on your hard disk either, right? When you hit delete, it just goes to the card catalog and deletes that entry. It doesn't actually remove the bits and bytes that make up that file from the disk. And that is the key reason why it is not sufficient to simply hit delete. In most cases, that delete button is not going to get rid of that file. It's going to shred that card catalog. So this is what it looks like if we're talking about a partition on a hard disk. Kind of clarify this and make it kind of simple to understand. Your disk has all the files written on it in a structure. Think of them as the shelves. And in this case, the card catalog is the master file table. It's a database, just a list of all of the files and their locations on the physical medium. Think of that as the card catalog. So when you hit delete, it just removes that entry from the master file table. It doesn't actually go and overwrite that space on the disk. The data is still out there. So a hacker or someone with some technical skills or special software doesn't need to use that card catalog. They can scan through that whole disk and locate the bits and bytes that make up that file and still retrieve the information. So while you've hit delete and it doesn't show up in your file manager or whatever application you're looking at, those specialized tools, the people with the knowledge, can still get on that disk and they can still get access to that data. Which is why the destruction method is so important, right? Delete really is not going to be your solution here, but there are several families of options that are available. Several ways that you can actually destroy the data so that it is cleared off the disk so that people cannot retrieve it, right? And the first one is clearing. This is similar to the one you learn in any kind of basic computer coding class. It's scrambling the ones and twos of where that file actually exists. So 0 and 1s, the binary digits that exist out there on the disk. It's going to the shelf in that library, pulling the book off the shelf and shredding it, right? But it's important to know that modern technology, usually one pass isn't enough. Scrambling that space just one time probably isn't sufficient. You'll have to do it multiple times. And there are various products and ways. Check out our resources to get really down into the technical weeds, but clearing is sort of the basic level of data destruction, right? It's non-destructive, so you can continue to use that medium. that doesn't ruin your hard disk. But it will allow, in most cases, sufficient assurance that that data has been deleted. That's going to be where most people live. The next options here are purging. Right? If we're talking about magnetic data of some sort, you can just use a big magnet, right? But it only works on magnetic media. But it's sort of like if you've heard of a degaussing machine. You put a hard drive in there and you close the door and hit the button, and there's a big clunk, and it basically just blasts your hard drive with magnetic fields that just scramble the whole medium and make it unreadable to anything, right? And that gives you a little more assurance, but as you might guess, it also destroys the medium, right? So if you want to continue using that hard drive or that computer, good luck. It's not going to work. The data is truly destroyed. And of course, the last family here is destruction of the media itself, and that's removing data by rendering the medium it's stored with unusable. And that's usually pulverizing, burning, incinerating, shredding, all of those crazy sort of kinetic methods of getting rid of the actual media, right? And of course, that includes the hardware that data is stored on. So again, these are sort of very destructive methods, and you would use these only in extreme cases. Most of the time, you're going to be looking at some form of clearing that provides you with the option to continue using that medium.
I don't know. I think the Great Big Magnet's still my favorite. But so Mike mentioned earlier that data in the cloud is sometimes a special situation. And I think it's important to remember that with the quantity of data and programs and what we're collecting, what we have to store, what we have to do with it, it's really not practical for most of us to keep all of that information locally anymore. So it's really necessary to move it to the cloud. So the cloud it's used a lot, but it's sometimes misunderstood from the FERPA perspective. So we wanted to take a couple of minutes and clarify that a cloud service that holds your data is no different from any other contracted or outsourced function. And this is something that you would have shared information with the provider under the school official exception. We talked about those exceptions earlier. It does offer great cost savings and benefits. Again, we have vast quantities of data that we use, that we need to manipulate. In some cases, it is more manageable or more secure when it is outsourced to somebody that does this for a living, right? But in the end, under FERPA, this data is still your data. FERPA still applies if something goes wrong, if a complaint is made. You are the responsible party. It doesn't matter where the data lives. So there are some things that you should consider if you're thinking about using cloud services in education. So first of all, when you're thinking about the cloud, thinking about FERPA, you need to think about data security. If you have outsourced your data storage to a cloud service provider, you need to be asking questions. And the big questions need to be around security. Again, if they're holding your data, your risk exposure is going to change. So you want to ask them, what security services do you provide? What part of that's your responsibility? What part of that's my responsibility? And the answer to that question, by the way, it's a shared security model. You are ultimately responsible for these data. And if you're asking these questions and they don't want to answer them, that should be a huge red flag for you with this vendor. You want to ask them for details on how they perform their security control validation and their system monitoring. shoot, you may want to ask them if you can do the security testing. They are probably not going to let you in to do the pen testing, but you can always ask them the results of their most recent tests. They can show you that their systems are tested, effective, and that your data is going to be secure once they are storing it. So these are all things that can be written into your contract with the cloud provider, but you need to go into detail about security. You can include requirements for updated tests at regular intervals. All of these need to be considered as part of your contract. And then you also need to think about FERPA. For example, if you have data stored in the cloud, FERPA requires you to have direct control over those data. So how are you going to do that if your data is stored someplace else? How are you going to enforce other federal, state, or local laws? Can you access your data? Remember, it's your data when you need it. And if for some reason you can't, again, huge red flag with that provider. And then you also need to know if the provider you're considering intends to use your data for any other purposes, for data mining, for tracking, for sale if it's not de-identified. Again, ask the question. If they don't want to answer, there's a flag. If they answer wrong, another flag. The data is yours and you are responsible for it. So I talked about contracts, and when you share data under FERPA, Mike talked about this earlier, it's a good idea, in some cases a requirement, in all cases it's a good idea, to have a written agreement in place. And we do have some great resources on our site for you if you have questions. So your written agreement is your contract around the data. And again, it's not mandatory under the school official exception, which is probably what you're going to use to share data with the vendor or for other purposes. It is a best practice to have it in place. If nothing else, it ensures that the other party is aware of the responsibilities under FERPA. And then this also serves to lay out all of the expectations and requirements that you have that allow you to comply with FERPA. So quickly, and again, we have resources on this on the website, the written agreement should designate the third party as an authorized representative of your agency. It needs to specify the PII elements that will be disclosed, the purpose of the disclosure, and then, because we're talking about it, it's really important to include data destruction in this written agreement. You can specify the methodology for the data destruction. You can specify certification that it's been done, and you can specify consequences. So this lays out the policies and the processes, and it just establishes these joint reasonable methods for the protection of your students' personally identifiable information.
And as Andrea mentioned, today we're talking about so much data that there's no way anybody's doing this alone. You have partners, you have an ecosystem that you're relying on. In many cases, these folks are offering services or platforms that your data is being stored on. You can't get by anymore without relying on at least some third-party vendors. So it is super important to realize that when it comes time to get rid of that data, there are certain considerations around things like this. And Andrea touched on a few of these. If for example, your data lives within a data center someplace, whether it's in the United States or out in a foreign country, how is that data being when you are terminating your contract, when you're done, or when that data is destroyed or deleted? How long does that data stay resident? Is it actually deleted? Can they articulate to you what methods they're using to get rid of this data so that it doesn't languish forever? The recent history, the last couple of years especially, has been filled with incidents of incidental vendor releases, things like vendor backups that contain data that was long since deleted, but the backups remained, and years later those backups are discovered by hackers or involved in a data breach, and the school is finding itself going, I didn't even know this data existed, right? So there are certain risks associated with third-party vendors, and you can address a lot of those in the process of creating those written agreements. But there are other things such as the assurance of the deletion. Do you have not only a data destruction provision in your written agreement, but also do you have some sort of assurance methodology in there? Is someone actually signing asserting that the destruction has taken place? Right? Organizations a lot of times very easily say, "Oh, sure, we do that." But in the particular case of your data, was it accomplished? And so, one of the things that you can do, include in your written agreements some written assertion of deletion. So when your contract is terminated and if you elect to go to a different provider or something of this nature, you have some written and signed agreement binding an individual to the fact that they are attesting that the data was in fact deleted. Right? You have to agree to this up front, right? So in many cases, when we think about deletion, when you think about just going down and running a tool and deleting things, unfortunately, that's not the way it works in these big cloud environments. So managing your own expectations around data destruction and the removal of data from these ecosystems, and understanding that sometimes it takes a while. So build that into your process and expectations, right? So that you can understand that these environments are complex. They're often replicated across many data centers. So destruction happens in sort of a rolling fashion. And so keeping that in mind it'll ease your worries a bit, and also facilitate that communication, that understanding when you're building those written agreements with your third parties. The bottom line of this slide is that contracts are your friend. They're your way of making sure that your third parties, your vendors, your service providers are in fact handling the data in a manner that is consistent with how you would manage the data inside your own organization. Remember, as Andrew said, the data doesn't stop being your data just because it gets put into some third-party vendor system. It's still your data. So they need to protect it at a level that is at least commensurate with what you would have done with your own on-premise systems, right? So make sure that you embed these best practices, right? When you're writing these contracts, when you're creating these written agreements, embedding these best practices around data minimization, around prohibitions on redisclosure, about data mining and advertising, all of these things kind of come into play here. And put in some sort of way for you to get some assurance that these are actually happening, some sort of audit provisions that allow you to get some metrics back to make sure that your vendor is performing as expected, right? Again, recent history has shown us, vendors promise a lot up front, but how are you assured that they're actually following through on those promises during the lifetime of the time they're rendering service to you when your data is in their systems? Some feedback. As Andrew mentioned, there's a couple of ways to do that. When they have security assessments done, can you get copies of that or redacted copies of that, so to know that in general that they're following best practices and that sort of thing. And it also, I want to stress due diligence and vendor selection, right? It's oftentimes hard to make a decision in a sea of vendors and shiny promotional materials and things to know what exactly each vendor is offering and what degrees of protection that they offer. There's a lot of lingo and industry speak. So do your due diligence, right? Bring in the folks that are required to make sure that you have a clear understanding of what that vendor does and what they're providing to you, and where those delineated shared responsibilities are in protecting your data. Doing so is going to make not only make your IT folks be able to sleep at night without worrying and literally biting their fingers off waiting for something to go bump in the night. You'll have that much more assurance, and you have something to fall back on if there's an issue down the road. You had all of your ducks in a row. You had good contractual agreements, and you have some recourse then to ensure that they are in fact complying with the law. Data destruction policies are a huge thing. Just to kind of circle all the way back to the beginning of this conversation, they are an integral part of that data governance process, right? You determine what data you're going to intake, how you're going to manage it, what operational uses, how you're going to store and then eventually get rid of this data when it is no longer required for your organization. There's the big circular process here: capturing, organizing, utilizing, and managing. And that data destruction piece is part of that good management process, a critical piece. Otherwise, things pile up and you end up, your data warehouse looks like the world in WALL-E, where everything is kind of stacked up willy-nilly everywhere, right? So it is a critical piece to have that, to have data destruction policies in your data governance process, so that you manage that life cycle through all of its various steps. So, when we talk about data destruction, this kind of brings us back to transparency in how you're managing. When we're talking about data in schools, we're not talking about our data. We're talking about the data of parents and students, right? And they deserve to know, what data are you keeping? What data are you collecting? How is it managed? And ultimately, are you keeping our data forever? Or what are you doing with our data, right? This is hugely helpful, not only in building a strong rapport with your community, and keeping them informed on what is happening with their data, but it is also fabulous for you to understand how you work with the data, right? They say the best way to know is to tell somebody how to do it. In this particular case, if you're being transparent with what you're collecting and what you're doing, it requires that you know what data you're collecting and what you do with that data and how you manage that data. In the end, this is not only about managing the relationship with the people whose data that you are stewards of, but it's also about reducing the risk to your own organization. Not only in terms of liability, legal liability in case of something like a data breach, but also in reducing your attack surface, right? Cyber criminals are looking for nexus of information. They're looking for big places that have a lot of data that they can snag and grab this information and make money off of it. This is a business for them. So to the degree that you can reduce your data footprint, you're looking at that much less damage, that much less impact, and ultimately making yourself a smaller target. So you're not only doing lots of positive things to keep the works of your data governance process running smoothly, but you're also reducing your likelihood of being involved in a data breach or a cyber incident, and you're building that sort of strong rapport with the folks whose data you're collecting and using. So I know we've thrown a lot at you today around data destruction. You've been hit with FERPA and state laws. This is a lot for anybody to digest. So we'll leave it there today, and we'll want to thank you sincerely for spending the last hour with us as we talk about this important subject. We do want to, if you do have questions, if you're watching this on our website or on your computer and you have a question about data destruction or about FERPA or about anything related to student privacy or data security, give us a call. We love to talk to you out there in the field. Andrea and I answer calls all the time from folks with questions, and we would love to hear from you. Here's all of our contact information. We have phone numbers, fax machines, if people still use those. We've got email addresses, and of course, our website at studentprivacy.ed.gov is a great resource for you to find all those wonderful resources we talked about in this session, plus many more. So don't be a stranger. We would love to hear from you. And with that, we will say thank you very much, and we will see you in our next session.
Thank you.